This video will show how to replace the axles and bearings on all models of the Bortola. On the Bortola, you need to remove the bearings to get at the axle between them. So the procedure is the same for replacing the bearings or replacing the axle. There are several methods for installing bearings, including hydraulic presses like at the factory, mechanical and screw presses, and the hammer and socket method, which we'll be using today. It doesn't require any fancy or expensive equipment, and it provides good control to prevent the axle from skewing and possibly damaging the aluminum hub. The rear Bortola uses a bearing that's a little different. If you have trouble finding it, go visit our web store at store.prolite.net and you'll find everything you need. Regardless of the method used, when tapping out a bearing, you always apply force through the inner race. This has a potential for causing damage to the bearing, and because of this, we recommend that every time you do this, you replace the bearings with brand new, fresh ones. The tools you will need for the front wheel are quite simple. Because the end caps are not threaded, they're press-fed, you can usually remove these by hand, but it can be a little difficult. So I like to use a tool like a 4mm Allen key, wedge it against the inner lip of the end cap, and press it free. For replacing the bearing, we'll need a metal hammer along with a 13mm socket for the front wheel. The ends of the axle are recessed below the edges of the hub, so you'll need a way to exert force on the axle without damaging either. At the factory, they'll use a jam fit tool to knock the axle out, but you might not have that tool at home. A simple solution that you probably do have is a Presta valve cap. It's made of nylon, so it will keep the aluminum safe, and it's just the right size. If you support it with a small bolt, it will allow you to tap out the axle without damaging it. So I'll start by pressing out the end caps on both sides. And we're ready to begin. I'll begin by fitting the protective cap, and now I can just tap this through. It'll need a little bit to get started. To remove the remaining bearing, I'll use any convenient heavy tool like a 10mm Allen key, and I'll just tap it through. Now to replace the first bearing, I'll put it in place. I'll grab my 13mm socket, line that up. Using my steel hammer, I'll start to tap in gently. Once it starts to go in straight, I can use a few heavier taps, but don't overdo it. When it starts to near the end, use lighter strokes. Flip it over. Now I'm going to insert the shaft, and now repeat the process to tap in the other side bearing. So now I'll make sure that there's no play and that it spins smoothly. And I can replace the end caps. And test it out. It's good. For the rear wheel, the tools you're going to need are the same as removing the free body. That's two 5mm Allen keys, as well as a 10mm to brace the axle and remove the second end cap. For installing the drive side bearing, you'll need a 20mm socket, and for the non-drive side, a 17mm will do the job. So let's get started. First, remove the end caps. Now I'll secure the axle on this side with the 10mm Allen key. So now the axle is exposed and ready to be removed. This is an alloy axle, so you should never use a steel tool to tap it out. Instead, use a protective rubber hammer or a wooden mallet to keep it safe as you remove the bearing. I like to tap out the smaller non-drive side bearing first, since it's a little easier on the axle. Because of the excess length on one side to accommodate the free body, you'll want to replace the drive side bearing before you replace the non-drive side. So let's get that out next. I'll tap that out using an appropriately sized heavy tool. So now I'll place my fresh bearing and line it up. Take my 20mm socket, making sure that it lines up with the outer race. And I'll start with light taps, watching carefully to make sure the bearing does not skew. Once it starts to go in deeper, you can use heavier strokes, but don't overdo it. Once you see that it is nearly seated, use lighter taps. It is possible to drive it too far. Now I'm ready to insert the axle. And we'll get started with the non-drive side bearing. Of course, this isn't going to work, so I would recommend inserting the free hub and using that as a support, or using a couple of pieces of wood to support the outside of the hub. As before, we'll use the socket. This time the 17mm will do. Line it up with the outer race and start tapping it in. Gentle at first. Once it gets close, use lighter taps. Now I'm going to check for play and to make sure that it spins smoothly. I want to remove the free hub for that. There's no play and it seems to spin smoothly, so I'll put it back together and give it one final test. And now reassemble the non-drive side. Make sure that when you're putting it back together, you don't forget the axle collar. Sometimes the spacer shim inside the free hub body comes out of alignment. So you'll need to line things up inside before inserting the free hub back into the wheel. Tighten it up, but not too tight. And it's good. So it's ready to go on the bike, ready to ride.